The heartbreaking story of Dennis Westerlind from Holdfast, Alaska. He had never been to Alaska, not once, but on a cold night in November 2020, he loaded his entire life onto a ferry, watched the lights of Washington state disappear into the dark, and sailed into 36-foot seas with his wife and his little girl, toward a place he'd only ever imagined. Dennis Westerlind of Holdfast, Alaska, didn't stumble into the wilderness. He chose it, at a cost that most people watching his videos will never fully understand. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that choice took from him and what it gave back. Dennis Westerlind did not grow up on a farm. He did not inherit land. He did not have a grandfather who taught him to trap, or a father who showed him how to build a cabin from scratch. He grew up in suburban New England, the kind of upbringing that leads most people toward a predictable life, a steady job, a reliable paycheck, a home in a neighborhood where everything works. Dennis's early adult years followed that exact pattern. He lived in a small apartment in eastern Massachusetts with his wife Amy. He worked as a lobsterman for his father-in-law's fishing company. Amy ran the office, handling the books and the day-to-day administration. From the outside, that life was stable, not glamorous, not exactly thrilling, but stable. The problem was what was happening on the inside. Somewhere in those years of hauling traps and filing paperwork, a different idea had taken root, the kind that doesn't leave once it arrives. Dennis and Amy started talking about land, real land, not a yard, not a garden plot, not a weekend hobby farm. They were talking about a life built around self-sufficiency, removed from the grid, dependent on their own hands and nothing else. Most people have versions of that conversation and then file it away. Dennis and Amy did something different. They started saving. Every dollar they didn't spend on the apartment, on extras, on the kind of casual spending that quietly absorbs most people's income, they kept it. Eventually, they had enough to buy overgrown land in western Maine. The price was around $5,000. The land was in rough shape. It didn't come with infrastructure or irrigation or a cabin. It came with trees and dirt and the chance to build something from zero. That's exactly what they did. And if you think building a working off-grid homestead in western Maine was the end of the story, here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. They cleared the overgrown acres by hand. They built a cabin. Amy trained as an herbalist and grew her practice. Dennis farmed the land and took on odd jobs to keep the operation running. Year by year, the Maine homestead became a real, functioning off-grid property. Most people in that position would have stayed. They had built something that worked. They had systems in place, skills they'd earned through trial and error, a community they were part of, and a home they had built with their own hands from $5,000 raw land. Walking away from all of that would take a very specific kind of reasoning. The reasoning Dennis and Amy used was simple. Maine wasn't the dream, it was the training ground. Alaska had been in the back of their minds for years, not Alaska in a general, vague sense. They had a specific vision, remote land, true subsistence living, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor is far enough away that your survival depends entirely on you. In late 2020, they made the decision that most people around them couldn't fully understand. They sold the Maine property, packed what they could fit in their car, put their young daughter Lena in the back seat, and drove 3,200 miles to Bellingham, Washington. From Bellingham, they boarded a ferry. What happened on that crossing is something Dennis has described in interviews, and it stays with you. The Northern Pacific in November is not the same body of water that people picture when they hear the word ferry. The seas that night reached 36 feet. For context, a 36-foot wave is roughly the height of a 3-story building. The boat was tossed around for nearly 5 days. Dennis had worked the water as a lobsterman. Rough seas were not new to him, but this was different. Even he acknowledged that. They made it to Juneau. Then the ferry docked, and they drove onto Alaskan soil for the first time in their lives. And if you think that arrival was the end of the difficult part, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. The plan when they landed in Alaska was to establish themselves on the Kenai Peninsula. They found a 2-acre homestead on the outskirts of Kenai National Wildlife Refuge and bought it. The location gave them access to salmon runs on the Kenai River. They could hunt moose and elk. They could fish. They could learn how Alaska actually worked before pushing deeper. What they had not prepared for was arriving in November. Alaska in winter is a physical shock that you cannot read about and truly understand. You have to experience it. Dennis has talked about the first thing that was hardest to adapt to, and it wasn't the cold, it was the light. The sun doesn't come up until 10:30 in the morning during deep winter on the Kenai. By 3 in the afternoon, it's dark again. That's roughly 4.5 hours of usable daylight for every task that needs to happen outdoors. And in those early months, almost every task happened outdoors. Amy's perspective on the same situation was slightly different. She noted that arriving in winter had one advantage. They got the full reality of Alaskan life without any cushion. They knew immediately what they were dealing with. No soft landing, no easing in during the easier months. The hardest version first. Over the next few years on the Kenai, the Westerlinds worked. They fished for salmon, they hunted. They learned to preserve Copper River salmon using a traditional sun and smoke method that requires no electricity. They learned how the fishery worked, what the land allowed, and how the seasons dictated their schedule. But something was still off. The Kenai Peninsula, for all its wilderness, had grown. It had traffic, it had people. It had the feeling of a place that had been discovered and developed, and that was not what they had come to Alaska for. As Dennis put it, it was too crowded, too much like Maine. They wanted the real thing. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. In the spring of 2024, the Westerlinds made their second major relocation within Alaska. They moved to the eastern interior, a region that is fundamentally different in character from the Kenai Peninsula. They bought a 7-acre off-grid log cabin near the northern entrance of Wrangell St. Elias National Park. The purchase was made in cash. The cabin had no connection to the power grid. The nearest significant supply point was in Anchorage, and getting there required a drive that took around 17 hours round trip. Read that again, 17 hours for a supply run. That number is one of those details that doesn't fully register until you start thinking about what it means in practice. If you run out of something, or something breaks, or you need a part you don't have, you're looking at a full day and night commitment just to restock. There is no convenience here. There is no running to the hardware store. There is no backup option down the road. Their mailing address is now a P.O. Box in Slana, Alaska, a community so small and so remote that it falls within the federally designated subsistence resident zone for Wrangell St. Elias National Park. That legal designation exists because people living in these areas cannot reasonably access commercial food systems the way the rest of the country can. The law recognizes that. It gives residents the legal right to harvest from the land, fish, game, forage, in a way that exceeds the limits placed on outside visitors, or even most Alaskan residents in less remote areas. The difference between what they could take in the subsistence zone versus what they had been allowed on the Kenai was significant. Dennis explained it directly. On the Kenai, for their family size, they were permitted to dip net and keep 45 sockeye salmon per year. In the subsistence zone, the harvest allowances reflected something closer to how people actually lived before supermarkets existed. This was not a hobby. This was food security. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. The YouTube channel was not the original plan. Dennis and Amy did not move to the interior of Alaska to become content creators. They moved because they genuinely wanted this life. The filming came after. In September 2024, the same year they completed the move to the interior, they bought a GoPro. No professional equipment, no production team, no strategy built around what the algorithm would reward. They started recording themselves doing the things they were already doing, and they posted it. Dennis described the early period in straightforward terms. They just started taking videos of themselves messing around on the homestead, and people took to it. What people responded to was specific. Most homesteading content on YouTube follows a recognizable pattern: garden tours, animal updates, seasonal harvests, cozy kitchen moments. The Westerlinds didn't do that. They showed what their life actually looked like. Building an A-frame chicken coop with a living sod roof for insulation against interior Alaskan winters. Hunting moose, hunting porcupine, which is not a glamorous meal but is a protein source when you're 40 miles from the nearest road with any traffic. Driving 17 hours for groceries, getting visited by wolves. The wolves are worth mentioning specifically. Slana sits within wolf territory, and the Westerlinds homestead is close enough to wilderness that wildlife interactions are not occasional, they're part of the regular pattern of life there. Seeing a wolf isn't a highlight reel moment for them, it's Tuesday. That authenticity was the thing that broke through. Within roughly a year of launching, the channel crossed 200,000 subscribers. By mid-2026, it was sitting above 216,000, with 181 videos and over 32 million total views. For a channel that started with a single GoPro and no plan to be on YouTube at all, the growth was significant. But the number that tells the fuller story isn't the subscriber count, and that's what comes next. The channel's growth gets a lot of attention. The subscriber count and the view numbers are the things people point to when they talk about Holdfast Alaska's success. But the more important accounting is the one that doesn't appear in any analytics dashboard. Before Alaska, Dennis and Amy had an income from the fishing company. Then in Maine, Amy's herbalism practice and Dennis's farming income kept them functioning. On the Kenai, they worked in the local real estate market to supplement what the land provided. Each time they moved further into the life they wanted, they moved further away from reliable external income. By the time they reached the interior, the 7 acres near Slana, the subsistence zone, the 17-hour supply runs, there was no traditional income structure left. They were homesteading full-time. Everything went into the land and the life. That is the context that explains why Dennis put it in those terms when he described their decision to start filming. This wasn't a passion project layered on top of a day job. The channel became a necessary part of how they sustained themselves. The GoPro wasn't just documentation. It was eventually part of how they kept the lights on, if you can use that phrase loosely for people who generate their own electricity. But what doesn't make it into the content, and what the comments rarely account for, is what the life demands from the people living it. Dennis and Amy are not characters in a documentary. They're raising a daughter, Lena, in a place where medical care requires a significant journey, where school and social life look nothing like what other American kids experience, where the work of staying alive and warm and fed is a full-time occupation separate from anything else. They gave up proximity to family. They gave up the kind of community that most Americans take for granted. Neighbors you can knock on the door of, a hospital within a reasonable drive, a grocery store. They gave up predictability. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. And that next part is where you start to understand what holding fast actually means. The name of the channel is not accidental. In maritime culture, and Dennis came from a maritime background as a lobsterman, a holdfast is a device used to anchor things in place. It's what keeps a line from slipping, what prevents a structure from drifting when the current pushes against it. The term is borrowed from biology too, where certain marine organisms use holdfast to anchor themselves to rock in rough water, surviving conditions that would destroy anything without a secure grip. Dennis chose that word to name the channel. You don't have to stretch very far to understand why. The story of the Westerlinds is, at its core, a story about refusing to drift. Every decision they made, the Maine land purchase, the crossing to Alaska in 36-foot seas, the move from the Kenai to the deeper interior, the willingness to film their lives and let the camera see the unglamorous parts, was a choice to hold on to something they believed in, against everything that would have made letting go easier. That word, heartbreaking, in the title of this video isn't about tragedy in the conventional sense. There's no single moment of catastrophe to point to. The heartbreak in Dennis Westerlind's story is quieter and more personal than that. It's the weight of every comfortable thing a person has to release to become who they want to be. It's the moment you drive away from a homestead you built with your own hands, the place your daughter took her first steps, because you know the dream is actually somewhere else. It's 5 days in 36-foot seas with your family, not knowing exactly what you're sailing toward. It's a winter with 4 hours of usable daylight, rebuilding your sense of self in the dark. Those aren't dramatic moments. They're just the true cost of the life Dennis and Amy Westerlind chose, and they paid it, repeatedly, without looking for a way around it. Most people watching the channel see the result. The cabin, the salmon, the frost on the windows, the wolf prints in the yard. What they don't see is the decade of accumulated choices that made all of it possible, and what had to be sacrificed to get there. And if you think you already know how this chapter ends, the current one, you don't. Because what's happening with the channel right now is where things take an unexpected turn. As of mid-2026, Holdfast Alaska is still active and still growing. The channel is running a YouTube membership program, which gives the audience access to members-only videos and posts. That addition represents something meaningful in terms of how the Westerlinds are building their operation. It's not just ad revenue, and it's not just views. It's a direct relationship between them and the people who follow the channel closely enough to pay for deeper access. The content hasn't softened. The 17-hour supply run still happens. The subsistence hunting and fishing still form the backbone of how they eat. The cabin near Slana is still off-grid, still subject to the particular demands of Alaskan interior winters, still a place where wolves pass through, and the daylight in December is a resource you plan around. What has changed is visibility. The Epoch Times ran a long feature on the Westerlinds in October 2025. The New York Post covered them. The coverage treated them not as novelty, not as people doing something eccentric for clicks, but as a genuine example of a family that built a life around a conviction and followed it all the way. Over 32 million views on 181 videos. That's the product of one GoPro, one family, and a specific decision to show what this life actually looks like, instead of what it's supposed to look like. Dennis Westerlind started as a lobsterman in Massachusetts, working for his father-in-law, living in an apartment, with a version of this life existing only in conversations he and Amy were having late at night. He is now a subsistence homesteader in the Alaskan interior, raising his daughter within a short distance of one of the largest national parks in the world, feeding his family from what the land provides, and documenting every piece of it for an audience that keeps getting larger. The heartbreak in that story isn't that it went wrong, it's how much it cost to make it right. Dennis Westerlind didn't walk away from a bad life. He walked away from a fine one, a stable one, a comfortable one, because fine and comfortable were never what he was after. The Holdfast Alaska channel is still posting. The family is still in the interior, still in the subsistence zone near Slana, still running a homestead that depends entirely on their own capabilities and what the land around Wrangell St. Elias provides. The membership program is growing. The content is still raw and honest in the way that made people pay attention in the first place. What comes next for Dennis and the channel is an open question, but the direction of travel has been consistent since that apartment in Massachusetts. Deeper, more remote, more committed, more themselves. So here's what I want to know from you. Dennis gave up a career, a homestead he built, proximity to family, and a version of security that most people would have held on to, all for a life in the Alaskan interior with a 7-acre cabin and a GoPro. Do you think the trade was worth it? And more honestly, is there something in your own life you've been holding back from, the way Dennis held back from Alaska for years? Let me know below.